The first sound of gunfire scattered the residents of Silver Creek like a flock of frightened birds, sending them rushing into shops and homes as dust swirled in the afternoon heat. Pearl Stevens pressed herself against the wall of the mercantile, her pale blue dress collecting grit as she watched the chaos unfold. At 22, she had never spoken a single word in her life, not since being found as a child wandering alone outside town after an Apache raid. Some called her cursed, others simple-minded, but none had ever heard her voice. It was 1875 in the Arizona Territory, and life moved relentlessly forward regardless of who could or could not speak. Pearl's eyes followed the commotion as Sheriff Walton attempted to restore order on Main Street. The disturbance had been brief, just a drunken miner firing his pistol skyward, but it was enough to disrupt the quiet afternoon routine. Mrs. Abernathy, who had reluctantly taken Pearl in after she was found, never let the girl forget she was a burden. "Girl, get back here and finish the washing." The older woman called from the doorway of the general store, scowling at Pearl as if her silence was a personal affront. Pearl nodded obediently and turned away from the scene, her shoulders hunched. 12 years had passed since they'd found her wandering the desert, mute and terrified, and in all that time, Mrs. Abernathy had never once called her by her given name. She was simply girl, a convenience, a pair of hands to work, but never a person worthy of true care. As Pearl made her way back toward the store, a commotion at the far end of the street caught her attention. A group of riders was approaching, trail worn and dusty. Leading them was a man whose very posture in the saddle suggested confidence. Tall and broad-shouldered, he rode a magnificent chestnut stallion that pranced nervously at the lingering smell of gunpowder. "Isaac Evans and his men," someone nearby whispered. Back from driving cattle up to Prescott, Pearl paused, watching as the riders dismounted in front of the saloon. Isaac Evans removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with sun-bleached strands. His face was tanned and weathered, but he couldn't have been more than 30. When he smiled at something one of his men said, the expression transformed his serious face into something Pearl found herself unable to look away from. "Girl," Mrs. Abernathy's voice cracked like a whip. "Are you deaf as well as dumb? Get moving." Pearl flinched and hurried inside, but not before Isaac Evans glanced in her direction, his eyes meeting hers for just a moment. She felt her cheeks flush as she retreated into the dim interior of the store. The laundry wouldn't wash itself, and Mrs. Abernathy wasn't known for her patience. Pearl plunged her hands into the cold water, scrubbing at stubborn stains while her mind drifted to the man with the kind eyes. The next day dawned bright and clear, the heat already building as Pearl swept the boardwalk in front of the mercantile. Her hair was tied back in a simple braid, her faded dress clean but patched in several places. Mrs. Abernathy never saw fit to spend money on new clothing for a girl who would never attract a husband. "What was the point, morning miss?" The deep voice startled Pearl, causing her to nearly drop her broom. She looked up to find Isaac Evans standing before her, his hat in his hands. Up close, she could see his eyes were a warm hazel, crinkled at the corners from years of squinting into the sun. "Didn't mean to frighten you," he said, smiling slightly. "Just wanted to say good morning." Pearl nodded, her customary response to any greeting, and returned to her sweeping with renewed vigor. "Name's Isaac Evans," he continued, seemingly undeterred by her silence. "I run the Circle E Ranch about 10 miles west of town." When Pearl didn't respond, Isaac cleared his throat. "And your name is?" "She don't talk," Mrs. Abernathy said, appearing in the doorway with her arms crossed over her ample bosom. "Never has. Found her after an Apache raid years back. Probably saw something that scared the words right out of her." She said this as if Pearl wasn't standing right there, hearing every word. "Name's Pearl, though what good a name does for someone who can't say it, I'll never know." Isaac's eyes never left Pearl's face. "Well, Miss Pearl, it's a pleasure to meet you regardless." The kindness in his voice made Pearl's chest tighten. She glanced up briefly, offering a small smile before returning her attention to the boardwalk. "What can I help you with today, Mr. Evans, Mrs. Abernathy asked, her tone considerably warmer than it had been when addressing Pearl. "Just picking up some supplies. Getting ready for roundup," Isaac replied, though his eyes lingered on Pearl a moment longer before following Mrs. Abernathy into the store. Pearl continued her sweeping, but her thoughts were in disarray. Few people in town bothered to speak directly to her anymore, having given up on receiving a verbal response years ago. Isaac's simple courtesy had affected her more than she cared to admit. Inside the store, she could hear Isaac placing his order: coffee, flour, salt, tobacco, the staples of ranch life. Mrs. Abernathy's voice rose and fell in animated conversation, clearly impressed by the successful rancher's patronage. "Finest cowhand in the territory, they say, Mrs. Abernathy was saying as Pearl slipped back inside, moving silently to arrange a display of canned goods. "Started with nothing but a few head of cattle and built the Circle E into something to be proud of. Just been fortunate," Isaac replied modestly. His eyes found Pearl again, watching as she worked. "Miss Pearl, would you mind helping me with these supplies? My wagon's just outside." Before Mrs. Abernathy could protest, Pearl nodded and gathered several of the parcels in her arms. The older woman's mouth thinned with displeasure, but she said nothing as Pearl followed Isaac outside. "Thank you," Isaac said as they loaded the supplies into his wagon. "Been in town long?" Pearl held up both hands, fingers spread, then a second time with only 2 fingers extended. 12 years, Isaac guessed, and Pearl nodded, pleased that he understood. "That's a fair stretch. I've been here about 8 myself, came west after the war looking for a fresh start." Pearl listened, enjoying the sound of his voice. It had a gentle cadence, despite its depth, like the steady flow of the creek after spring rains. "My ranch hands and I will be in town for another day or 2 before heading back," Isaac continued. "Maybe I'll see you around." Pearl nodded again, then gestured toward the store, indicating she needed to return to work. "Of course," Isaac said, replacing his hat. "Thank you for your help, Miss Pearl." As she watched him walk toward the saloon, Pearl felt something stir within her chest, a feeling so foreign she almost didn't recognize it as hope. That evening, as Pearl prepared supper, Mrs. Abernathy watched her with narrowed eyes. "Don't you be getting ideas about that Evans fellow," she warned. "Men like that don't look twice at girls who can't even speak their minds. Besides, he's just being polite. That's his way." Pearl kept her face carefully blank as she stirred the stew, but her mind was racing. She knew Mrs. Abernathy was probably right. Why would a successful rancher be interested in a mute woman with no prospects and no family? Still, the memory of his kind eyes lingered. The next morning, Pearl rose before dawn as usual, starting the fire and beginning her chores. Mrs. Abernathy had long ago decided that since Pearl couldn't contribute through conversation, she would contribute through labor. From dawn until dusk, Pearl cooked, cleaned, and helped in the store, her silence making her nearly invisible to most customers. As she hung laundry in the yard behind the store, Pearl heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Looking up, she was surprised to see Isaac Evans riding toward her, leading a second horse, a gentle-looking Palomino mare. "Good morning, Miss Pearl," Isaac called, dismounting with easy grace. "I was wondering if you might like to go for a ride. It's a fine day, and Buttercup here is the gentlest mare in my string." Pearl stared at him in astonishment, then glanced back at the store, uncertainty written across her features. "I already spoke with Mrs. Abernathy," Isaac assured her. "Told her I needed someone to show me where the best fishing spots are along the creek. She seemed happy enough to have you guide me." Pearl suspected that Mrs. Abernathy's agreement had more to do with Isaac's position in the community than any desire to allow Pearl a moment of enjoyment. But she wasn't about to question this unexpected opportunity. She nodded eagerly and hung the last sheet on the line before approaching the Palomino with careful steps. The mare nuzzled Pearl's outstretched hand, and a smile bloomed across the young woman's face. "You've ridden before?" Isaac asked, and Pearl nodded. Before coming to Silver Creek, before the raid that had taken her family and her voice, she had ridden often. With Isaac's help, Pearl mounted the Palomino, adjusting her skirts as best she could. The feel of a horse beneath her again after so many years was exhilarating. Isaac swung up onto his own mount, and they set off at an easy pace, heading towards Silver Creek itself, the waterway that had given the town its name. As they rode, Isaac talked about his ranch, his cattle, and his plans for expansion. Pearl listened attentively, occasionally nodding or gesturing to show she understood. It struck her that he spoke to her as if expecting her to understand, not as if she were simple or damaged. The realization warmed her from within. At the creek, they dismounted, and Isaac spread a blanket beneath the shade of a cottonwood tree. From his saddlebags, he produced a simple picnic bread, cheese, dried beef, and apples. "I thought you might enjoy a change of scenery," he said, handing her an apple. "Mrs. Abernathy mentioned you rarely leave the store except for church on Sundays." Pearl accepted the apple gratefully, taking a bite and savoring the sweet crispness. She couldn't remember the last time someone had thought to do something kind for her without expectation of return. "I've noticed you around town for years," Isaac admitted after they had eaten. "Always working, always watching. You see things others miss, don't you?" Pearl tilted her head, considering his words before nodding slowly. "I thought so," Isaac smiled. "Sometimes the quietest people understand the most." They spent the afternoon by the creek, Isaac fishing while Pearl gathered wildflowers that grew along the bank. When it came time to return to town, Pearl felt a sense of regret that surprised her with its intensity. As they approached the store, Isaac cleared his throat. "I enjoyed your company today, Miss Pearl. I was wondering if perhaps you might like to ride out to my ranch sometime. I could show you the place, introduce you to the hands." Pearl's eyes widened at the invitation. She hesitated only briefly before nodding, a smile lighting her features. "Excellent," Isaac said, looking pleased. "How about Sunday after church? I could come fetch you." Another nod, and then Pearl dismounted, handing the reins back to Isaac with reluctance. "Until Sunday, then," he said, tipping his hat before turning both horses toward the livery. Pearl watched him go, her heart lighter than it had been in years. When she turned to enter the store, she found Mrs. Abernathy watching from the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Got yourself an admirer, have you?" the older woman asked, though her tone suggested she found the idea preposterous. "Don't set your hopes too high, girl. Men like Isaac Evans don't marry women who can't even call their children to supper." The word stung, but Pearl had grown accustomed to such barbs over the years. She slipped past Mrs. Abernathy and returned to her chores, but for once, not even the older woman's cutting remarks could dampen her spirits entirely. Sunday arrived with agonizing slowness. Pearl wore her best dress, a faded blue calico that had once belonged to Mrs. Abernathy's niece, and arranged her hair with special care. Mrs. Abernathy watched these preparations with obvious skepticism, but refrained from comment. After church, Isaac was waiting outside as promised, his wagon ready for the journey to the Circle E. Pearl climbed up beside him, ignoring the curious stares and whispers from the church congregation. "Folks around here aren't used to seeing you out and about," Isaac observed as they left town behind, "but they'll get accustomed to it." Pearl glanced at him questioningly. "I plan to invite you out to the ranch regularly," he explained with a smile, "if that's agreeable to you." The drive to the Circle E took just over an hour, during which Isaac pointed out landmarks and shared stories of his early days in the territory. Pearl listened attentively, occasionally gesturing or nodding to communicate her interest. When the ranch buildings came into view, Pearl couldn't help but be impressed. The main house was modest but well built, with a wide porch and several outbuildings arranged neatly around it. Corrals held horses of various colors, and in the distance, cattle grazed on the rolling grassland. "It's not much compared to some spreads," Isaac said, watching her reaction, "but it's home." Pearl shook her head emphatically and gestured broadly at the scene before them, her expression clearly conveying that she thought it was wonderful. Isaac's smile widened. "I'm glad you think so." He introduced her to his ranch hands, a diverse group of men who tipped their hats respectfully to Pearl. Their easy acceptance of her presence and her silence touched her deeply. The day passed in a pleasant blur as Isaac showed her around the property. They ate dinner with the hands in the cookhouse, where Pearl was treated with a courtesy she rarely experienced in town. As the sun began its descent, Isaac suggested they watch the sunset from a hill overlooking the ranch. Seated on a fallen log, they watched as the sky transformed into a canvas of reds, oranges, and purples. Pearl had never seen anything so beautiful or felt so at peace. "I've been thinking about you a lot, Miss Pearl," Isaac said suddenly, his voice quiet but steady. "About how you communicate without words, about how much I enjoy your company despite, or perhaps because of, the silence between us." Pearl turned to look at him, uncertain where his thoughts were leading. "I know we haven't known each other long, not really, though I've admired you from afar for some time, but I'd like to court you properly if you're willing." Pearl's breath caught in her throat. She stared at him, searching his face for any sign of mockery or pity, but found only sincerity. Slowly she nodded, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he must hear it. Isaac's expression brightened. "May I?" he asked, reaching for her hand. Pearl placed her smaller hand in his, marveling at the gentleness with which he held it. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon, Pearl found herself wondering if this was what happiness felt like. The courtship that followed was unlike anything the residents of Silver Creek had ever witnessed. Isaac called on Pearl regularly, bringing small gifts, a ribbon for her hair, a book of poetry he would read aloud to her in the evenings, wildflowers gathered along the trail to town. Mrs. Abernathy watched these developments with increasing bewilderment. "I don't understand it," Pearl overheard her telling the Reverend's wife one afternoon. "What does a man like that see in a girl who can't even speak? It's unnatural, if you ask me." But Pearl knew what Isaac saw. He saw her, not just her silence, but the person behind it. He noticed how she communicated with her eyes, her hands, her smile. He appreciated her quiet strength, her kindness, her patience, and Pearl saw in Isaac a man who didn't need constant words to fill the spaces between them, who understood that some things went deeper than speech. As summer turned to fall, their connection deepened. Isaac taught Pearl to ride again properly, and they spent hours exploring the countryside around the Circle E. He showed her how to mend fences, how to brand calves, how to read the weather in the clouds. She showed him how to recognize edible plants, how to move quietly enough to observe wildlife, how to communicate without making a sound. One crisp October evening, as they sat on Isaac's porch watching the stars appear, he turned to her with unusual seriousness. "Pearl," he began, taking her hands in his. He had long since dropped the formal miss from her name. "These past months have been the happiest of my life. I never knew how much I needed the quiet you bring until you were part of my days." Pearl squeezed his hands, her eyes bright in the gathering darkness. "I love you," Isaac said simply. "Your silence, your strength, everything about you, and I was wondering." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small gold ring. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Pearl's eyes filled with tears as she nodded emphatically, throwing her arms around his neck. Isaac held her close, his own eyes suspiciously moist. "I promise to love you always," he whispered against her hair. Words or no words. The town of Silver Creek buzzed with gossip when the engagement was announced. Many expressed disbelief, some disapproval, but a few those who had observed the couple's devotion to one another offered sincere congratulations. Mrs. Abernathy was perhaps the most shocked of all. "You're certain about this?" she asked Isaac directly one day when he came to collect Pearl for a ride. "A man in your position could have any woman in the territory, one who could, well, speak her mind. With all due respect, Mrs. Abernathy," Isaac replied, his tone polite but firm. Pearl speaks her mind quite clearly to those willing to listen, and she's the only woman I want. The wedding was set for the first week of December. Pearl, with the help of the seamstress, prepared a simple but lovely wedding dress. Isaac arranged for a small celebration at the ranch following the ceremony. 2 days before the wedding, a fierce winter storm descended on the territory. The temperature dropped dramatically, and snow began to fall, an unusual occurrence so early in the season. By morning, Silver Creek was blanketed in white, and the roads to outlying ranches were nearly impassable. Pearl stood at the mercantile window, watching the swirling snow with growing concern. If the storm continued, would Isaac be able to reach town for their wedding, Mrs. Abernathy noticed her worry. "Weather like this, no one's getting through from the Circle E," she said bluntly. "Might have to postpone your wedding, girl." The thought was unbearable. Pearl had waited so long for happiness, had almost given up hope of ever finding someone who would see past her silence. The idea of delay, even for a few days, filled her with dread. As evening approached and the storm showed no signs of abating, Pearl made a decision. Slipping upstairs, she packed a small bag with her wedding dress and a few necessities. She left a note for Mrs. Abernathy, one of the few times she had ever communicated through writing explaining her intentions. Then, bundling up in her warmest clothes, she slipped out the back door into the storm. The livery was dark and quiet when Pearl arrived. She knew which horse to take, a sturdy bay gelding that Isaac sometimes rode when visiting town. The animal recognized her, nickering softly as she saddled him with hands that trembled from both cold and determination. The journey to the Circle E would be dangerous in such weather, but Pearl knew the way by heart now. With a silent prayer, she guided the horse out of town and into the snow-covered landscape beyond. The wind howled around her, driving snow into her face and making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. The temperature continued to drop, and Pearl soon lost feeling in her fingers despite her gloves. Still, she pressed on, trusting the horse to follow the familiar trail when she could no longer discern it herself. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time became meaningless in the white void surrounding her. Pearl began to fear she had made a terrible mistake. What if she became lost? What if she froze before reaching the ranch? Just as despair threatened to overwhelm her, the bay's ears pricked forward. In the distance, a light glowed faintly through the curtain of snow. Hope surged through Pearl's veins, giving her renewed strength. She urged the tired horse forward toward the beacon. As they drew closer, Pearl could make out the shapes of buildings, the Circle E. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by exhaustion. She had made it, but the journey had taken its toll. Her limbs felt leaden, her thoughts sluggish from the cold. The bay stumbled into the ranch yard, snorting with effort. Pearl tried to call out, but of course, no sound emerged. She attempted to dismount but found her frozen limbs uncooperative. As darkness began to edge her vision, she saw the door to the main house fly open, spilling golden light across the snow. "Pearl," Isaac's voice sounded distant, though she could see him running toward her. "My God, Pearl!" Strong arms caught her as she slipped from the saddle. Through half-closed eyes, she saw Isaac's face, etched with concern and disbelief. "What are you doing out in this? You could have died." His voice broke on the last word as he carried her swiftly toward the house. Inside, warmth enveloped her as Isaac set her down gently before the roaring fire. His hands moved quickly, removing her snow-encrusted coat and gloves, rubbing her frozen fingers between his palms. "Why, Pearl? Why would you risk yourself like this?" he asked, his voice raw with emotion. Pearl looked up at him, her eyes conveying what her frozen lips could not, that nothing, not even a blizzard, would keep her from him, from their wedding. Understanding dawned in Isaac's eyes. "The wedding," he murmured. "You were afraid we'd have to postpone." Pearl nodded weakly, then gestured toward her bag, which Isaac had carried in with her. "You brought your wedding dress," he said softly, shaking his head in wonder. "Oh, Pearl, my brave, foolish Pearl." He gathered her into his arms, holding her tightly as warmth gradually returned to her limbs. "We'll be married as planned," he promised. "Even if it's just us and the preacher, I'll get word to town somehow that you're safe." Pearl rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Despite her exhaustion, contentment filled her. She was where she belonged. The storm raged for another day before finally abating. True to his word, Isaac sent one of his hands to Silver Creek with news of Pearl's safety and confirmation that the wedding would proceed as planned, though with a smaller guest list due to the difficult travel conditions. Mrs. Abernathy, upon receiving the news, surprised everyone by insisting on making the journey to the Circle E for the ceremony. "Raised her since she was 10, the older woman said gruffly. "Ought to be there when she weds." On the morning of the wedding, Pearl stood in the guest room of Isaac's home, soon to be her home, as Mrs. Abernathy helped her dress. The older woman was uncharacteristically gentle as she buttoned Pearl's gown and arranged her hair. "Never thought you'd find someone, Mrs. Abernathy admitted as she placed a small wreath of dried flowers on Pearl's head. "Shows what I know." There was a grudging respect in her voice that Pearl had never heard before. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. The ranch hands stood as witnesses along with Mrs. Abernathy and the few townsfolk who had braved the snow-covered roads. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Isaac kissed Pearl with such tenderness that tears sprang to her eyes. The celebration afterward was filled with laughter, music, and dancing. Pearl danced with her new husband, her feet barely touching the ground as he whirled her around the room. The joy she felt was almost overwhelming. After years of silence and solitude, she had found someone who heard her without words. As the evening wound down and guests prepared to leave or settle into the bunkhouse for the night, Isaac led Pearl outside onto the porch. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed by snow and moonlight. Stars glittered overhead in a clear sky, as if celebrating with them. "Happy, Mrs. Evans?" Isaac asked, his arm around her waist. Pearl turned to him, her eyes shining with all the words she couldn't say. She nodded, reaching up to touch his face gently. "I never thought I could love someone this much," Isaac confessed. "From the moment I saw you, something told me you were special. Different, yes, but in all the ways that matter most." Pearl stood on tiptoe to kiss him, pouring all her feelings into the gesture. When they parted, she pointed to the stars, then to him, and finally placed her hand over her heart. "As many stars as there are in the sky, that's how much you love me," Isaac guessed, and Pearl nodded. "I feel the same, Pearl, always will." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the moonlight on the snow. Tomorrow would begin their life together, a life built on understanding that ran deeper than words ever could. Years passed, and the Circle E prospered under Isaac and Pearl's care. They welcomed a son, then a daughter, children who grew up understanding that their mother's silence held its own kind of eloquence. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard, Isaac reached for Pearl's hand. "I've been thinking about the first time I brought you here," he said. "How perfect it felt to have you beside me." Pearl smiled, squeezing his fingers gently. 7 years of marriage had only deepened their connection, their ability to communicate without words. Their 4-year-old daughter, Lily, came running up the steps, her dark hair so like her father's escaping its braids. "Papa, look what I found," she exclaimed, holding out a perfectly formed feather. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Isaac said, examining the treasure with appropriate solemnity. Lily turned to Pearl next, climbing into her mother's lap to show her the feather. Pearl nodded appreciatively, stroking her daughter's hair. "Mama loves it," Lily declared confidently, having long ago learned to interpret her mother's gestures as easily as she understood spoken words. As Lily scrambled back down to rejoin her brother, Isaac looked at Pearl with wonder. "Our children understand you perfectly," he said, "just as I always have." Pearl's eyes shone with happiness as she watched her family. She had found a place where her silence was accepted, even cherished a home where she was loved completely. That night, as they prepared for bed, Isaac spoke of expanding the ranch, of dreams for their children's future. Pearl listened, offering her thoughts through gestures and expressions that Isaac had no trouble interpreting. As they settled beneath the quilts, Isaac pulled her close. "I thank God every day that I found you," he murmured against her hair. "My silent Pearl who speaks volumes with her heart." In the darkness of their bedroom, with her husband's arms around her and the sounds of their sleeping children down the hall, Pearl felt a fullness in her chest that sometimes seemed too great to contain. She had traveled from isolation to belonging, from being unwanted to being cherished. And though she had never spoken a single word in all their years together, Isaac had heard her, truly heard her. In that hearing she had found her voice at last.